Hello everyone. Welcome back. Cultured Khun here. This is amongst your weekly Bible study sessions, the second one. Hopefully, if you've joined the journey, the first one we did Thursday, and today being Saturday, you've had some time to think, had time to let it marinate, and we are going to move along in our Bible study series. So, today we're going to discuss who. In the last episode, we discussed what. What is the Bible? We're going to talk about who, and we want to do more of a character analysis so we can understand some of the nuances and underlying meanings conveyed by the symbolism, symbology, and the symbolic language carried by these religious figures. So first, we need to talk about the books of the Bible, because obviously that's what we're referencing. So 66 books, as referenced before, 27 books in the New Testament, and then you can do the math for the Old Testament. So if we see who wrote the majority of the New Testament, it was Apostle Paul. Saul originally, who then became Saint Paul. And the New Testament, the canonical text which contains Christ, we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, James, Jude, Peter, and I forgot who wrote Hebrews, it's still undecided. But yeah, for the most part, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, Paul, James, Jude. So that's 8. 8 writers roughly. And of those, Saul, who from Damascus used to persecute Christians, who then became Saint Paul, wrote 13 letters. So that's Corinthians, Galatia, Ephesians, so on and so forth. And the significance of knowing these names, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, Paul, James, and Jude, is for one, well, James and Jude were siblings of Christ, the younger siblings of Christ, and they were skeptical of his purpose in life. And if you look at John 7 verse 5, or even you look at Acts 12 verse 12, you find that this skepticism was then acted upon once Jesus had died and resurrected. That's what they had realized, oh, my brother wasn't like cuckoo. Now, what's the significance of me talking about these names, say their names, is these guys are cardinal to comprehending the canon, as we mentioned before, the compiled Christian canon. And when you strip down to their layers of understanding, when you understand their lifestyles, when you understand their love languages, when you understand their cultures, their context, their creeds, and the societal structures they're operating under, it will help you navigate through the text. Okay, so if we look at Saint Paul, Apostle Paul, the one who is responsible for most of the writing in the New Testament, he was a Jew, but he had that Greco-Roman understanding. So he was perfectly aligned to spread the word and evangelize the good gospel in the Roman Empire. Obviously, for those of you who know the history of the Roman Empire and Christ, Pontius Pilate had Christ killed at the order of the Jews because they had denied him as their king. And there were no kings more superior to that of Caesar at the time. And so after committing deicide, somehow the Roman Catholics managed to acquiesce the title of the church and spread that through their lands. But they combined it and made it Roman Catholic Church. And the first pope was believed to be Peter, the rock of the church, who had denied Jesus 3 times, if you remember. So we've referenced Paul, Saint Paul. We've referenced Peter. Mark was a cousin to Barnabas, who was also a spiritual leader at that time. James, Jude, I've mentioned as well, siblings to Christ. They didn't believe his story. Matthew wrote to the Jews, and he wrote appealing to them to follow Christ. Luke wrote to the Gentiles, and he wrote Acts and Luke appealing to those who existed outside of the cultural norms of Judaism. So now the significance of this, when you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John, when you look at those Gospels, when you look at those canonical descriptions of Christ, and you look at the stories and the similarities, some people looking at it from an outside perspective would say, well, Matthew and Luke contradict each other. And it's like, no, they're not contradicting each other. They are two sides of the same coin, just being written from different lights. So if you look at Matthew, again, there's reference to Jewish culture, there's reference of a house. If you just look at the baby in Bethlehem and you look at how his story is portrayed and you look at how the narrative is framed in Luke, and please do this yourselves, just do a comparison between Matthew and Luke. It's the same story, but told differently. And we all do this. We all change narratives to fit the audience and we adjust according to their understanding. And I referenced this in the video prior to this, is that you need to speak according to your audience. You need to adjust to their understanding, not only so you can speak into their heart, but also so you can convey the message clearly and concisely, speaking their language. It doesn't mean you change the story necessarily, but you can change the frame of the narrative so that they can view it clearly through their lens. Okay? So we've spoken in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, James, Jude, Peter, and Paul. Now let's look at the Old Testament. So the Old Testament, we know the Psalms written by David. We know the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. We know those are written by Moses. Let my people go. That guy who went to Pharaoh. Yes. So the significance of the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament, as currently constructed, was originally translated from Hebrew. It went from Hebrew to Greek to Latin to Old English to however many languages it is now. And it was gathered, as I mentioned in the previous video, over time. So different people wrote about their experiences. Now, when we say, no, this guy just high, no, what this, that's like, no, that's not the case. We, unlike the Muslims or the Jews, believe that our scripts, our writings, our doctrine, our creed, our canon was compiled by characters who had gone through adversity. So relatable characters, uniquely diverse individuals, from fishermen to tax collectors to drunks to prostitutes to lepers. Everyone had a story to tell and everyone features in the Bible, and you can see it peppered along with different personalities. So the character gives our creed color because we can see ourselves in the stories. Not everyone will be a Job. Some of us might not be a David. Some of us might not be a Noah. Some of us might not be an Abraham, an Isaac, a Moses. Some of us will never be a Jesus, but we emulate the examples of the men who, like us, had scruples on their character. The men who, like us, made mistakes. The men who, like us, were tempted and gave in to flesh. Because the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. So the reason why you find that they are examples of failure, examples of people missing the mark, examples of contradiction or even culture clash within the text, is so you can relate to the narrative, because it's written for people, by people. And the belief is that it is inspired by God. So inspired meaning we take influence from our inference and interpretation of the immaterial. And in placing material form, we are trying to implement our understanding on a base level. Because for those of you who have had any religious or spiritual experiences, you know they are ineffable, which means they are unexplainable and they're hard to put to words. And language as itself is limiting as an interface with the divine. So we use models, parables, and etiology, analogy, allegory to convey the conventions of Christ, even though he is beyond our material understanding. So now let's just recap. Bible was written by uniquely diverse characters. New Testament, 27 books, 13 of which were written by Paul, right? Jesus' brothers had a part in writing. John the Baptist had a part in writing. The early apostles had a part in writing. The early popes had a part in writing. The Old Testament concerns Jews. The first 5 books, the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Those books concern Judaism and Jewish practice and upholding those traditions, customs, values, beliefs. Through that, we have the constant relationship of the Jews and reminder of the Jews being the elects and everyone else being the reprobates. and us following the Star of David and following the house of Moses and following that lineage through until we find ourselves in the New Testament, which concerns Christ. 4 main Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Matthew, written for the Jews. Luke, written for the Gentiles. Okay? So, what do I want you guys to take from this? What I want you guys to take from this is that the Bible was written by people. Yes, the people were prophetic. Yes, the people had a message. But don't miss the message because of the meddling of the messenger. We should be able to interpret examples, especially of exemplary individuals who lived hard lives, who some were just fishermen, who had these grandiose experiences and tried to convey them to you guys. Okay? Their character was transformed by what had happened to them. And I think you can have a mirror relationship with the Bible if you start to read beyond the text, if you start to see the symbols as signs for revelation in your life. Now, with the next video, we're going to go into the structure of the Bible a bit more. We're going to go into the storytelling and how we move from one narrative to the next. I'm going to traverse across the lines from Judaism to Christianity, and I'm going to pick on a few of the central figures and summarize, as I have been doing, giving you guys bite-sized bits for you to consume, to understand, and to make engaging with the text a bit more interesting. So for those of you who've subscribed so far, thank you. Those of you who've commented, please, let's keep the positive feedback loop going. I do enjoy your feedback. And the rest of you, have a good day. This was Kultured Khun. Cheers.